Wild Guns is not an arcade game, but it sure as hell acts like one, to the point where it comes fully equipped with an attract mode and a ranking board. Gone are the days where you can just start up a game and leave it idle for the demonstration to kick in. It sounds ridiculous for me to care about this, but it really can set a mood. As for the setting, it's clearly rooted in space western influences. The manga Cobra was a big source of its inspirations, which I can see, but honestly the closest media I can aesthetically compare it to is Trigun. But that wasn't published until a year after Wild Guns was released. Regardless, I love the stupid mash of futurism and western themes. A moralistic battle between stoic heroes and ravenous outlaws, but with automatic grenade launchers and giant robot crabs. Fuck, I'm in. For those cowpokes that never heard of this title, by first impressions I wouldn't blame you for mistaking this for a light gun game, with the reticle moving across the screen. Oh no, this artifact of a genre is known as a shooting gallery. Wild Guns was not the first to create this, with games like Dynamite Duke and Cabal preceding it, but I can assure you, Wild Guns perfects it, at least in my opinion. But I only have the right opinion, so paying attention to your environment is absolutely key to survival, which can be very overwhelming when first starting out. You obviously need to shoot your foes, so naturally your focus is on aiming the reticle at the enemies using the D-pad. But you also have to pay attention to your character's position. Holding the fire button is what keeps you in place. You have to be in this stance in order to dodge. When it comes to dodging, you need to pay attention to the enemy's reticles and not so much the bullets themselves. That's the trajectory where the bullet will land. So basically, stay the hell away from enemy reticles. You're given a little warning with the watch out text bubbles too. However, if you're quick enough, you can actually shoot the enemy's fire. Sometimes a good defense is being offensive. You can jump over these attacks too, and that can be more viable than dodging in some situations. What about these thugs shuffling their way over to you? You can only take care of them by ceasing your fire and tapping the fire button once for a melee attack. This applies to dynamite thrown at you too, which when successfully thrown back, dishes out some serious damage. If things get overwhelming, you can unleash your bomb to clear the screen. This gives you a second to breathe, but I would only recommend using this when you're desperate, as these bombs are hard to come by. Another ability is quickly tapping the fire button to unleash your lasso. This freezes enemies temporarily. Some bosses can be affected by this too, which makes for a good strategy. So basically you have the foreground, the background, character position, reticle position, and multiple attacks to pay attention to simultaneously. This honestly sounds like hell, especially conducted with a fucking D-pad. But somehow, by some miracle from God, it works. Wild Guns only has a 2-character roster, with your choices being between Clint, very subtle name, and Annie. The Kid Gang kills Annie's family. Annie big mad. Annie hire Clint. Annie and Clint kill gang. The end. Clint has quicker melee reaction timing, and his dodge roll is longer than Annie's. However, Annie is more nimble. I recommend playing as her if you're a beginner. You're immediately thrown into the action in Carson City. You have the standard affair of outlaws and bandits trying to gun you down, but if you've noticed, some of these guys drop pickups after they're defeated. Gold bags, silver, and blue rocks. So normally, high scores don't motivate me when a game is challenging, because frankly, I just want to stay alive. But Wild Guns rewards you with an extra life every 100,000 points. That sounds like a lot, but you'll acquire lives semi-frequently as long as you're being diligent. But more importantly, enemies drop guns too. You can obtain the shotgun, machine gun, and grenade gun. The shotgun has a wider spread and can affect enemies in a close proximity of each other. And for the machine gun, realistically, it does just as much damage as your stock weapon, but due to its rapid fire, it just blows through enemies at a quicker rate. As for the grenade gun, it's slower, but takes the most damage and can affect 2 to 3 enemies bundled together. You can also pick up this pellet gun. It's completely useless. You want to shoot it so you can return to your normal fire. So after putting a few holes in your foes, you're thrown into a bar, and this is where you're introduced to the dynamite-wielding enemies. As explained earlier, you want to be quick to pick one up before it explodes to throw it back at your enemies. Continuing on, you fight a borderline kaiju-sized robot named Big Bertha. The attack patterns are relatively easy to pick up on, and eventually it will be blown into scrap metal. This is the basic core structure to each stage. Roughly 2 waves of enemies, a mid-boss, and then the stage boss. After Carson City, you can actually choose what stage you want to confront next. Each stage has a set amount of points you'll be rewarded with when completed, but this is also a marker of difficulty. High reward, harder stage. If you're fresh, I would tackle these stages chronologically. So that makes Desolation Canyon next. In this stage, you'll come across machines called missilos. Remember the lasso technique I covered earlier? These guys and a handful of other enemies can dish this out on you as well. And if you're caught by it, this is especially a problem when there's multiple enemies on the screen firing at you. You can shake out of it by rapidly pressing the fire button, but it's best to avoid being stunned entirely. On this note, I want to take a step back for a second. The game just covered most of the basics in the first 2 stages. Obviously, you will come across new enemies with different attack patterns for you to adapt to, but that's besides the point. Even after you choose a different level after completing Carson City, you would have encountered stunlock enemies anyway. This learning curve progression is clearly implemented to feel natural, so props to the devs because to me, this is a marker for a damn good level design. Later on in the canyon, you'll eventually reach the mechanized tank called Desert Storm. Ha ha. Its flamethrower will switch up its patterns to try to throw you off, but as long as you're centered and pay attention to the flame's trajectory, you'll get through it. But there's one more mechanic I haven't covered yet, and despite knowing about Wild Guns and seeing gameplay footage of it prior to making this video, I had no idea about the Vulcan gun. Do you see that bar in your HUD? That slowly increases the more you blast through enemies. What happens when this is full? You go full T-800 and just make it rain bullets. Enemies cannot hurt you in this state. This is the kind of battle strategy that ends wars. This happened to me in the middle of the armored train stage, and it was a pretty nice surprise. To me, this was the cherry on the more than exceptional cake. After the mowdown and defeating the mid-boss, you'll come across this dude with a jetpack. He's a stage boss, and personally, I think this boss is the most annoying out of all boss fights. He's small, so you're constantly moving your reticle, has a lot of health, he's fast, has a variety of attacks, on top of the goon shooting at you in all directions in the background. There's a lot of maneuvering in this fight. One thing I would say in hindsight, the gold mine stage, although challenging during the enemy wave segments, is worth the same amount of points as the armored train for stage completion. But to be honest, the boss fight with the Duganess is much easier. You can actually use the lasso in some of these boss fights, and sure, you can use it on Jetpack McGee over here, but he's pretty hard to catch. The Mecha Crustacean over here is a different story. Because his core is stationary, it's much easier to exploit this. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the level progression I choose is usually Desolation Canyon, Ammunition Depot, Gold Mine, and finally Armored Train. The Gold Mine definitely wants you to be aware of all of your surroundings because enemies start out in higher elevations, so naturally, your focus is placed there. But then the game tosses you a curveball and throws in this bitch in a minecart on the bottom half of the screen. Be alert, because that definitely was a growing pain for me. The Ammunition Depot, I think, is the most balanced in terms of difficulty. What the fuck is that? The Ammunition Depot, I think, is the most balanced in terms of difficulty. Crystallian is a large target, so yes, locking it with the lasso isn't exactly hard to do, but at least it moves around and isn't as stationary as the Crab Gundam. And sure, a couple bandits walk in to throw you off, but it's not as overwhelming as the fight with Jetpack McGee over here. Once all stages are clear, the final battle begins. You're immediately thrown into battle with 2 mecha men. My advice is to lasso lock one of them and just unload and focus on one of them at a time. This is followed by 2 more waves and 2 mini-bosses until you're finally facing Kid. There's a lot going on here, and just like the jetpack fight, smaller targets moving around constantly is a pain. I found myself destroying the motion-detecting Vulcans first, so it made maneuvering easier. After he's defeated, Kid says his piece and the layer is destroyed. The end. Now, my first playthrough took me roughly an hour and a half, but after practice, I'm able to complete this game in 35 minutes without using any continues. And maybe you guys are thinking that's a short amount of time, but I have to tell you, that's one of the reasons I love this game. There are practical reasons why this game is short. One being is, the game was made in 5 months. In fact, it was so limited in funding that Taniguchi, the lead designer, was the voice actor for Clint in the studio bathroom. But secondly, this is kind of a luxury of linear games. You get to focus on level design and fill it with as much detail as possible. Something I caught on even when I was a teenager when I watched my pals play Bethesda games is that the assets were reused and NPCs looked like the devs hit the randomize button and spat them out on the terrain. And I understand why. It's a large game. It cut space on a disk and it reduced dev time, among many other reasons. And overall, I understand this is a different type of game. But that doesn't stop me from thinking it looks like straight up poop. Meanwhile, in a linear game like Wild Guns, the environments are gushing with life, Boss battles have large but detailed sprite work, and you never stop engaging with the action. Lately, gamers have been pretty audible about open-world action RPG fatigue from AAA devs. I've even seen people state that the people who like short games don't actually like playing games. No. I can play Xenogears beginning to end. Why? Because it's linear, the story has a purpose, and it's compelling. Very rarely does my time feel wasted in that experience. And this is a 60 to 70 hour RPG. And that's what I wish all games were like. Don't artificially extend the game with bloat. Trim the fat and make a cohesive and enjoyable experience throughout, regardless if it's an 80-hour game or a 3-hour game. Have you met Metroid fans? These are not long games, but these freaks love it so much that they drop multiple hours on it just to beat each other's speedrun records. It's this kind of passion that elevated Wild Guns as a cult hit. So much so that it was re-released as Wild Guns Reloaded in 2016, adding 2 additional characters to the roster, 2 additional stages, and new guns. You have Bullet, the Dash Hound with his sentry drone, and Doris, who specialize in explosives. I'm told using Bullet is a way to ease new players in, but I disagree. I think he's just a different way to play the game, like Doris. Because normally, when you're playing as Annie or Clint, you have to pay attention to your reticle and your character placement. With Bullet, yes, his reticle is more forgiving with his spread shot. However, you now have to focus on the reticle, Bullet, and the sentry drone's placement. This isn't bad or anything, it's just not as easy as reviewers have been expressing. Doris is the Zangief of Wild Guns, slow but deals heavy damage with her bombs. Holding in the fire button increases the amount of explosives thrown, and she has a powerful down smash attack. And I have to say, I'm sure I could try to get better with these new characters, but it really does feel this game was made with Annie and Clint in mind. The new guns are my favorite addition personally. Adding the lasers and the pulse cannon immerses you more into the sci-fi western setting. The additional stages are great too. Playing on normal gives you access to the underground stage, and after completing a playthrough on normal, hard mode is unlocked with the addition of the airship stage being playable. Both of these stages feel natural within the Wild Gun setting, and the stage bosses are just as big and brutal as any other boss fight. Although the airship boss is kinda tricky. It specifically requires you to move around more in order for you to shoot the sides of the ship. Other than these obvious differences from the SNES title, there are subtle changes as well. For instance, the lasso slows enemies down instead of just freezing them. The game is displayed in a 16:9 aspect ratio. Bombs affect a portion of the environment and not the entire stage itself, and supports 4-player co-op. Now, 4-player co-op sounds fucking awesome. However, the multiplayer is where my criticism sinks in. In fact, it's flat out disappointing and wasted potential. If you're tackling Reloaded on single player, you have unlimited continues, but if you have to rely on continues, you won't be ranked on leaderboards. Fine, that's no big deal. Unfortunately, in co-op, all players share a set amount of lives and there are no continues. At all. Zip. None. Nada. Let me draw this out. It's hard enough to find 3 more dorks like you to sit on a couch and play a re-released retro game from 1994. But to expect them to be experts at it too is just as likely as witnessing a mouse doing a kickflip on a tech deck. You could be a Wild Gun savant, but it doesn't matter unless your teammates are experts too. The game will come to a quick end. I really believe there should be a patch to restore individual player lives and continues. If you have the Steam copy of this game, there is a mod out there that restores continues in co-op, so I suppose this fix is better than nothing. It's really for this reason I would say the Steam version of Reloaded is the best between the Switch and PS4. Otherwise, sure, it's a great single player game on anything else. Overall, you can't go wrong with the original release or Reloaded, but I would categorize each game as different experiences. If you want an extremely polished single player experience, elevating an already fantastic game into an excellent game, yes, Reloaded has you covered. But if you want to play with the pale, stick to the original title. Wild Guns was made on a modest budget in the span of 5 months. If there was any excuse for this game to be complete garbage, that would be the valid reasons. But it wasn't. You could argue that the controls could be remapped, such as assigning left and right dodges on the L and R buttons, or dedicating the lasso to another button, but honestly, the current layout still works. This game is packed with intricate detail with the core concept of fun in mind. It is absolutely crazy to me that when this game was first released, Famitsu gave this title a 26 out of 40. Well, I'm here to tell you, Famitsu was straight up tripping. Wild Guns was truly capturing lightning in a bottle, and perhaps those financial and time restrictions is what pushed the Natsume team to its creative limit. If you're even vaguely intrigued by these games, I implore you to give it a shot. Because it truly offers an experience that's hard to replicate.
Howdy, y'all. It's Cowboy CatPat here, the slickest, sharpest, fastest school shooting, the slickest, sharpest, fastest gun con shooter here in the Midwest. You are wanted, dead or alive, preferably alive. So if you'd like to join all these kind folks on this list here, feel free to donate on my Patreon. I would certainly appreciate it. And of course, a big Patreon shout out to my trusty steed, Mexical50. What a sport. And it would be mighty fine if you folks left a like, comment, and make sure to hit that bell. It certainly helps me out. See y'all later, partners. Yeehaw.
I look great. You don't have to say it. It's okay.
You do. It just makes me think about how you're gonna look on our wedding.
Gay?